Hello, my name is Tanya Morningstar Darling. I'm the founder of Cellar Muse Wine Education. I'm a wine scholar, wine historian, writer, teacher, and I'm also Lakota. I'd like to address today a very important subject, the subject of the historical roots of exclusion for women and people of color in the American wine industry. As a historian, I believe that if we really want to create a more inclusive and equitable wine industry, it's first necessary to accept that the roots of exclusion are systematic, linked to cultural factors and historical events, which are imperative for people to understand if we want to create change. America has a complicated historical relationship to alcohol. And in order to wrap our heads around why this relationship is so complicated, we must first investigate the historical circumstances surrounding alcohol consumption in 19th century America, leading to the constitutional prohibition of drinking alcohol between 1919 and 1933. As the American relationship to alcohol relates to equity and inclusion, we have to investigate these events as they relate to 5 main communities: early European settlers, women in general, African Americans, indigenous people, and immigrants. Consider that early European settlers were primarily Anglo-Saxon Protestants seeking freedom from religious persecution in the New World. They were called Puritans for a reason, and their perspective on alcohol was very conservative. Consider now that American women generally were legally and socially second-class citizens, the wards of either their husbands or their fathers, with limited individual rights, independence from their relationships with men. Women couldn't vote, and it wasn't acceptable for women to drink in polite society. A woman's place was in the home, not in public life. Indigenous peoples of North America, as far as we know, didn't make or consume alcohol prior to colonial contact, so alcohol was new to Indigenous people. African Americans were, in most cases, slaves, and drinking wine in particular in America was the cultural domain of wealthy white men. After the Civil War, alcohol abuse ran rampant in America. Slaves were freed, and immigrants were pouring in from beer and wine-drinking cultures like Ireland, Germany, and Italy. Now imagine that the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men of the country are drinking like fish, which is tearing apart the Christian family values that colonial America was built on. Imagine that a huge part of the white population are racist, fearful of African Americans, and resentful of immigrants. Imagine that people are looking for someone to blame, and imagine that women who are suffering the violence and mayhem of a society full of drunken men are powerless. Perhaps now you can begin to understand what drove pious women to stop staying in their place at home and take to the streets to seek the power to make a change and the right to vote for prohibition. Yes, women's suffrage became linked to prohibition as women realized that the law would never pass without the female vote. Furthermore, as men started to enter the movement, racist and xenophobic propaganda became part of the prohibition movement itself, blaming immigrants for bringing their drunkenness to America, but also demonizing African American men as drunken, dangerous, and at-large in white communities. In the backdrop of all this, Indigenous people were considered less than human, merely an obstacle to be eradicated on the path to manifest destiny. Many tribal people were killed outright or through European diseases, and then communities were removed from their ancestral lands on large scale. The result was despair and trauma. So when alcohol was introduced, for many, it was a tragic combination. Alcohol became a plague on tribal societies, and that became another leverage point for racist propaganda against them. So in America, when we say our relationship with alcohol is complicated, it runs much deeper than just Americans' puritanical roots. Alcohol had a damaging history on many of Americans, and many Americans have been systematically excluded from the affluent parts of society who have historically enjoyed wine with connoisseurship and moderation. If you look into the history of European white drinking cultures, you'll find that the wine trade brought these cultures what I call the 3 Ps: pleasure, privilege, and prosperity. Perhaps you can also begin to see now how women and people of color have been systematically excluded from enjoying these benefits that wine can bring. It may seem heavy, but it is my belief that now is the time to heal our cultural wounds around alcohol as Americans and truly make wine a beverage for all people, from both a connoisseurship perspective and an economic one, by actively welcoming all people to both the trade and the consumer side of the wine world. If we hope to do this, we need to open our eyes, face that exclusion is systemic, and commit to changing our own biases so that we can move forward to create a more inclusive society where all people can benefit from the pleasure, privilege, and prosperity wine can bring. In doing this, we take a leap of faith that we will all prosper when we stop fighting for seats at a small table, but decide that we need a new table, one that can hold all that we all have to offer. Cheers to everybody and to your health.